In this video, you're going to be setting up your Ubuntu machine to work with Prisma. So there are a few dependencies we have to install before we can actually explore Prisma itself. If you're on Mac or Windows, your installation videos were the past two videos. This one is only for my Ubuntu users. So if you're still watching, I am going to assume you are using the Ubuntu operating system, and we're going to kick things off by actually just sticking with my Mac screen share, then we'll switch over to Ubuntu in about 3 minutes. So let's go ahead and jump right in. The first thing I'd like to do is get us set up with a database, and the database we're going to be using is Postgres. Postgres is an SQL database, and it pairs really well with GraphQL. SQL databases in general pair really well with GraphQL because with GraphQL, you have to be explicit about the exact fields and type definitions for those fields, making it an easy match. Later on in the course, I will show you how to set up Prisma with MongoDB if that's your cup of tea. Honestly, any database you can pick works because in the end of the day, Prisma abstracts that database away anyways. For now though, let's go ahead and grab Postgres, heading over to Heroku.com. Now there are plenty of places where you can get a Postgres database, and you do not have to use Heroku. I use Heroku because they have a free tier for what we're about to do, so you actually don't need to pay in order to get a basic database up and running for your sample application. So take a moment to log in if you have an account and sign up if you don't. I'm going to go ahead and log into my existing account, and once we're in, we should see a dashboard. Now, if you're creating your new account, it's likely going to send you through some new customer flow where it asks you to create an app, and that's good because it's exactly what we're going to do. I'm going to create a new application, and we're going to give it a name. I'm going to start with my last name in all lowercase letters. Now, there's no spaces allowed, so I will use hyphens to separate my words. That is mead-prisma-dev server. Awesome. Now, we don't need to touch the region. You likely have a default region good for your location around the world. You could customize it to Europe if you wanted to, but since I am in the US, I'll stick with that. And I'm not going to touch the pipeline at all. All we're going to do is create the application, and once the application is created, it's going to bring us to a set of steps describing how we can start to deploy things. Now, there are plenty of features for Heroku we're actually not going to need in this class. We really only need a very small subset of them, and we can get started by heading to the Overview tab for our application. What we're concerned about is installing add-ons. There's one for a Postgres database. So let's head over to the Configure Add-ons page, and from here we can search all of the available add-ons. You want to search for Heroku Postgres. Now there is a free tier for that, so once we click on Heroku Postgres, it's going to allow us to pick the option we want, everything from free to $12,000 a month. Let's go ahead and start with that free plan. I am going to provision this, which is going to create the database. And once the database is created, we're going to be able to click that in our add-ons list. It's going to bring us over to the page where we can learn a little bit more about our database. One important thing we need from here are the credentials that allow us to connect to this database. You can find those over in the Settings tab. Right here, we have the database credentials area, and we can view our credentials. This is the information that we're going to need to connect to this newly created database from the outside world. Now we're over on my real Ubuntu machine, and we're going to go through the setup process, and the next tool that we're going to be installing is pgadmin. pgadmin is a Postgres database GUI, so it's going to give us a graphic user interface to interact with our database. We can create data, update data, delete data, or read our data, all from an Excel-like view. Now, this is a really great tool. Obviously, we are still going to connect to our database using code. That's coming, but the GUI is just going to make it easier for us to track our data over time. Now for Ubuntu, what we're going to be installing is pgadmin, and pgadmin is the same tool we're installing on Windows and Mac. The only difference is that currently, even the latest version of Ubuntu doesn't support the latest version of pgadmin. So to talk about this, let's go ahead and crack open the Ubuntu installer. Right here, we are going to search for pgadmin. We are looking for pgadmin version 3. That's currently the only version available. Version 4 is out. It's essentially the same thing. It just looks a little bit nicer. So this tool is still going to work just great though. So I'm going to go ahead and install this one. I'll authenticate myself and it'll start off that installation process. Now, once this tool is installed, we're actually going to connect to our Postgres database using it. Once we have that connection set up, we'll be all done. Since the installation has completed, I am going to launch the application. In the background, we now have pgadmin version 3, and we are going to connect to our server. Now, by default over here, we have no servers, so we need to create a new one, and we do that using this little guy right here. This allows us to add a connection, and then we have to fill out the connection details. Step 1, we can just pick some sort of name that makes sense. You could use, for example, Heroku PG. Anything would work. It doesn't need to be specific to your credentials. Next up, we have our host, and this is where we start to pull some database information from our credentials page. So right here, I am going to grab that host value, copy it to the clipboard, bring it over to pgadmin and paste it in. Next up, we have the port. The default port for Postgres is 5432, and the same thing is true over here, so there's no need to make any change. Next up, we have maintenance DB. We are going to change that to be our database. So right here, I'm going to copy that database value. I'm going to paste it in as the value for maintenance DB. Then we're going to move on to the username and the password, both also values we have over here. So first up, I have the user. I'm going to copy that and paste it in. And then after user, I have the password. I'm going to copy that as well, pasting that in to the application. So from here, we have all of our information set up. We don't have to worry about any of the other tabs. And we can now go ahead and actually create this connection. It's going to warn us about saving passwords. We do indeed want to save the password to prevent us from having to provide it every single time we want to connect. Now, once we actually do get through that process, under server groups, we're going to have a single one. We have our Heroku Postgres server, and we can go ahead and actually connect to it, which is exactly what I'm going to end up doing. Now, right here, we have a few different views. What we're concerned with is the databases. Now, you'll notice that there's about 2042 to be exact, different databases on this one server. Now, we can't access all of them. We can only access the ones we've been given privileges to access. So, for example, if I try to click any random old database, we're going to get an error, permission denied, which is a good thing. Any database that has that little red X to it is not something that we're going to be able to access. What we're going to do, though, is scroll down and find ours. Ours starts with D63, so let's go ahead and work our way through this list. I have D1, D2, D3, D4, D5, D6 should be coming up real soon here, and right here we have D6, and we have a single database without that red mark next to it. This is the one we can actually connect to, and if I click it and connect, we can see the connection was indeed successful, and now I can expand that database and start taking a look at things like its data. Now, currently, there is nothing worth looking at inside of here because we haven't added any data to the database, but once we connect Prisma and start manipulating the data, we'll be able to view it over here. So for now, that's all we're going to do for pgadmin. We installed the tool, we connected it to our Postgres database that Heroku gave us, and now it's time to move on to the second thing we have to configure, which is Docker. We can learn a bit more about Docker by heading over to the browser and going to docker.com. If you've never used or worked with Docker before, that's perfectly fine. We're going to be using a very small amount of Docker in this class. Docker can be a complex tool in the whole DevOps space, and there are literally entire Udemy courses that just cover Docker. We don't need to worry about all of that. We're using a very, very small subset of its features. Now, what is Docker? Well, it's part of this whole containerization and virtual machine movement. So if I'm building up an application, I have my application code and I have my dependencies. Let's say I need to run on Linux and I also need Git and Node.js installed. Now I have a couple of options. I could choose to allow people who want to run the application to actually install all of those things. Then I could cross my fingers and hope it works on their environment, or I can bundle it all up into a container. The container, which in essence is a little virtual machine, can then be executed from anywhere Docker is supported, and the good news is that Docker is supported pretty much everywhere. Whether it's Mac, Linux, or Windows, you can run Docker containers regardless of what tools or dependencies they need. You don't have to slow down and install a whole bunch of stuff on your machine for every application. Instead, you just run the container. It's very easy to stop containers, to delete them, and to free up all of that space without trying to remember all of the dependencies you had to install. It's just a better way to manage apps. Now, there are two sides to Docker. There is the person creating the application and creating the container, and there's the person who's using the container to run the application. That's the side we're on. So we're not going to learn about the ins and outs of Docker, because in reality, we're just a user of Docker trying to run a container provided by somebody else. Now, we're here just to install it. To install Docker on Ubuntu, we have to work through a very manual process. So long story short, we're going to be running a bunch of commands from the terminal. Now, there are two articles we need in order to get the correct commands. First up, we are going to Google get Docker CE, that stands for Community Edition, for Ubuntu. The Community Edition is the free edition that we can use to work with Docker outside of an enterprise environment. Now, the first one is the one we're looking for, so make sure the URL matches up. This is what's going to allow us to install Docker, and there is just one more article that we're going to work through as well. I'm going to pull that up right here. That one is called Install Docker Compose. If we Google that, the first result is the one we're looking for, docs.docker.com/compose/install. This is another utility that we're going to need to actually take the Prisma application and get it deployed, which we'll work through in the coming up videos. For now, though, we have to install these tools, and we are going to work through this article, Get Docker CE for Ubuntu. If you want to go on your own, that's perfectly fine. Long story short, we're going to be running every single command shown in this article, so let's get to it. The first one is going to uninstall potentially old versions of things we have on our machine. Now, you might not have anything that you remember, but it's always a good idea to run it just in case. Perfect. And once that's done, we are just going to move down the list. So down below, we can go ahead and install using the steps for Ubuntu 16 and newer. I'm running on 18.0.4, so this is what I want. And there are a bunch of commands down below. First up, we're going to make sure everything is up to date using apt-get update. That might take a little while depending on how long you've gone between running it. And once that's complete, we're going to move on to actually allow ourselves to install from HTTPS. So right here, we're going to copy that command too. We're going to fire that off, and once that's done, we'll be able to continue on. Down below, we are going to configure ourselves with Docker. We got to run this command to get the official GPG key. And after that, what do we do? Well, we're going to go ahead and set up our fingerprint. I'm going to grab the command. I'm going to run it. Excellent. Now, after that, we move down below, and here we are actually configuring ourselves with the repository for Docker. This is where we can grab the stuff that we're about to install. So we're going to grab that command, run it from the terminal as always, and wait for it to finish. Once again, a very straightforward process. Now, once this is done, we're actually going to be able to install Docker's Community Edition. Down below, install Docker CE. We can update one more time. Once that's done, we are going to run the installation command for docker-ce, which is what we want. Let's go ahead and fire that off right here. I'm going to fire that off, and this could take a significant amount of time depending on your network speed and environment. Now, after we have the Docker Community Edition installed, we can go ahead and choose to install a specific version, which we're not going to do. We're just going to install the latest version, though you could run a command to get that done. So we can actually skip step 3 entirely and move on to step 4. Now, this is their way of verifying that things are working correctly. We could go ahead and do this, though it's not necessary. The way that we can verify is by running docker --version. If this prints a valid version, then we know we've installed things correctly. If you get some output like command not found, then things didn't install correctly, but don't worry, you can always open up a new question in the Q&A and I'll work with you to get unstuck. This installation method isn't ideal, but it is all we have for our Linux-based operating systems, so thanks for bearing with me as we ran through all of those commands. On Mac and Windows, it's a much easier click next type installer, but to each their own. Now, next up, we have the second article, which is much quicker. We're going to install Docker Compose, which we need as well. We can pick our path. We are using Linux, and all we have to do is run a couple of commands. So right here, we are going to fetch what we need. Make sure to grab the entire command, even what's not shown without scrolling. I'm going to fire that one off. And once that's done, we're actually going to mark that as executable using our chmod command. Chmod. I've never said some of this stuff out loud, so sorry if there's an official pronunciation for that. I don't come from the Ubuntu world, but I did want to make an installation video showing you how to get everything set up. So I'm going to run that over here, marking the file as executable, and then what are we going to do? Well, we're going to execute it. So right here, we can run Docker Compose with the version flag to make sure that it was installed successfully. If you're seeing a version print, then you're all done. If you're seeing an error like Docker Compose command not found, then something went wrong, and once again, just crack open a question in the Q&A. So there we go. We now have everything we need to actually continue on to the next video. Keep in mind that when you're running on Ubuntu, you are likely going to need to use sudo before all of the Docker and Docker Compose commands we run. I'll remind you in the future, but this is a quick reminder right now. So we are all set up. We have our database. The database has our credentials, and we've connected to the database already using pgadmin, the GUI we're going to use throughout this course. Now, aside from getting the database and installing and configuring pgadmin, we also just installed and configured Docker, which is going to allow us to run Prisma. That's the topic of the next video, so let's go ahead and jump right in.